Here's a stat that sounds impossible: Shane van Gisbergen just lost a spot in the NASCAR playoff standings at Richmond, and walked away from that same weekend in a better position than when he arrived. That's not a typo, and it's not spin. It's real math, and by the end of this video you'll understand exactly how it happened, because Richmond might have been the strangest, most jam-packed weekend of Van Gisbergen's entire NASCAR career. Let's rewind to Friday. Van Gisbergen climbed into the number 7 HendrickCars.com Chevrolet for Spire Motorsports, making just his 5th career start in the NASCAR Truck Series. Richmond Raceway is a 3/4-mile short track, the kind of place where oval experience usually matters more than raw talent. Van Gisbergen doesn't have much of that experience yet. He's still very much building his oval resume after years of road course dominance in supercars and NASCAR's National Series. So what did he do in just his 5th truck start? He ripped off a lap of 23.168 seconds and put the number 7 on the pole for the Black's Tire 250. Think about that number for a second. 5th career start. Most drivers spend years, sometimes their entire careers, chasing an oval pole like Richmond and never sniff it. Van Gisbergen did it before he'd even built double-digit truck starts. It's his first career oval pole in any of NASCAR's 3 national touring divisions, and it makes him just the 3rd foreign-born driver ever to claim a Truck Series pole, joining Marcos Ambrose and Daniel Suarez in that club. Van Gisbergen himself seemed almost stunned by it afterward, crediting the team for getting him comfortable fast and admitting he still doesn't fully know what to say about how quickly it's all coming together. His theory is pretty simple, though: trucks share a lot of characteristics with a cup car, and that translates directly into speed once he gets enough laps under him. But Friday's pole was really just the opening act. What made this whole weekend so brutal wasn't the pole, it was what came after it. Rain hit Richmond and pushed the truck race from Friday night all the way to Saturday afternoon. That single schedule shift turned Van Gisbergen's weekend into something almost nobody else in the garage was attempting: 650 laps of green flag racing, jammed into a single 24-hour window, between the truck race Saturday and the Cup Series night race on Sunday. To make matters even more demanding, Christopher Bell dropped out of the truck entry list entirely, which left Van Gisbergen as literally the only driver in the field even attempting that full workload. And for a while, he made it look easy. Van Gisbergen led laps in the truck race the way a pole-sitter is supposed to, running up front for long stretches before ultimately settling for a 4th-place finish. Not a win, but a clean, competitive, mistake-free run that carried real momentum into Sunday night. That's when things got complicated. Van Gisbergen rolled off Sunday's Cookout 400 from 31st on the grid. For most drivers, that's just a rough starting spot you fight through over 400 laps. But for a driver clinging to the final transfer spot in the chase standings, starting 31st with a playoff berth on the line is about as precarious as it gets. And it got worse fast. Austin Cindric, one of the drivers sitting directly above Van Gisbergen in points, was in the middle of what would become his best run of the entire 2026 season. On paper, that combination, SVG starting deep in the field while a direct points rival surges toward a big finish, looked like exactly the kind of night that knocks a bubble driver clean out of the playoffs. It wasn't quite what it looked like. And the reason comes down to one decision. Credit goes to crew chief Stephen Doran, who made the call that completely changed Van Gisbergen's night. At the start of the final stage, instead of following the rest of the field down pit road for fresh tires, Doran kept the number 97 out on older rubber and took the wave around. In one move, that gamble jumped Van Gisbergen from deep in the pack into the top 15. It was a real risk. Staying out meant SVG was now off sequence from basically everyone who had pitted, and the team desperately needed a caution flag to fall at the right moment to actually cash in on the strategy. It didn't come immediately. The whole gamble hung in limbo through the first round of green flag pit stops, but then the yellow finally waved, and it fell at almost the perfect moment, right as Van Gisbergen was cycling back up toward the top 15 again, still riding those older tires. From there, he simply held the position. Van Gisbergen crossed the finish line 14th, which, interestingly, matches his Richmond finish from a year earlier. Afterward, he explained that the number 97 was actually better than its qualifying effort suggested all night, running with the front half of the top 20 or better even before the strategy call. Once Doran's gamble put him in the top 15, he said the same driving line that worked for him in the truck race carried over perfectly to the Cup car, especially once tires started wearing, letting him roll the top of the track and pick up spots. Clean air helped too. Now here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because this is the part of the story that actually decides whether Richmond was a good weekend or a bad one, and the answer depends entirely on who you're comparing him to. Cindric finished 3rd. That result was strong enough to leapfrog Van Gisbergen in the overall standings and knock him down to 16th, technically outside a chase spot, sitting right on the bubble. Read as a single headline, that sounds like a disaster. But the driver who actually determines Van Gisbergen's playoff fate isn't Cindric. It's Ryan Preece, sitting 17th, the one-man SVG has to hold off to make the postseason. Since neither Van Gisbergen nor Preece picked up any stage points during the race, the entire gap between them came down almost purely to finishing position. Van Gisbergen crossed 14th, Preece finished 9th. Wait, that actually should have hurt him, right? Except it didn't work out that way, because Van Gisbergen's cushion over Preece actually grew. He went from 47 points ahead of Preece heading into Richmond to 50 points ahead after it. Lose a spot in the overall running order. Gain 3 points of separation from the driver who actually matters. That's the whole strange story of Richmond, wrapped into one sentence. So why does this matter so much right now? Because the picture at the top of the standings is locked in stone, while everything below it is absolute chaos. 7 drivers have already clinched their way into this year's 10-race chase: Denny Hamlin, Ryan Blaney, Ty Gibbs, Tyler Reddick, Chase Briscoe, Chase Elliott, and Christopher Bell. That leaves 9 spots still being fought over, with positions 14 through 18 in the standings all mathematically alive heading into the final 2 regular season races at New Hampshire and Daytona. And that group right now is bunched tighter than almost any chase bubble in recent memory. Bubba Wallace sits 14th, just 20 points ahead of Van Gisbergen in 16th. Cindric, sandwiched in between them at 15th, is only 7 points clear of SVG. On the other side of the cut line, Preece trails Van Gisbergen by that 50-point margin, and Ross Chastain, Van Gisbergen's own Trackhouse racing teammate, sits 18th, 63 points back. That's what makes Van Gisbergen's position genuinely fascinating with 2 races left. He's not simply playing defense against Preece and Chastain behind him. He's also within realistic striking distance of Cindric and Wallace ahead of him. A big finish at New Hampshire or Daytona wouldn't just protect his current spot, it could move him up the board entirely. Chastain, for his part, watched the exact same strategic opportunity play out for his teammate and knows precisely what it would have meant for the rest of the Trackhouse lineup if they'd found it sooner. He ran inside the top 10 for most of Saturday night before ultimately finishing 12th, later admitting that if the team had been executing that kind of strategy all summer, they'd be sitting in a very different spot in the standings right now. Van Gisbergen and Chastain weren't the only story hiding in plain sight at Richmond either. Hendrick Motorsports has spent most of 2026 adjusting to a brand new Chevrolet body, and Chase Elliott remains the only driver in that 4-car stable with a win this season, 2 of them, to be exact. On a night where Team Penske's Joey Logano ultimately took the checkered flag, Hendrick quietly parked all 4 of its cars inside the top 10, Elliott 5th, Kyle Larson 6th, William Byron 9th, and Alex Bowman 10th. Elliott actually credited a stage-ending gamble very similar to Van Gisbergen's for the result, saying his team stayed out while others pitted for fresh tires late in a stage, and it paid off across the board. Not a win, but after a stretch of genuinely tough months for the organization, a clean top 5 run with all 4 cars inside the top 10 is exactly the kind of night Hendrick needed. There's one more thread to this Richmond story, and it almost changed everything. Cindric's 3rd-place run, the exact result that bumped Van Gisbergen down onto the bubble in the first place, nearly didn't survive pit road. On lap 181, Cindric was pulling into his pit stall at the same moment Daniel Suarez was pulling out of his, and the 2 cars came within inches of colliding. It was Cindric's own front tire changer, Justin Armwood, who prevented disaster, throwing his air hose up and over the top of Suarez's car as it passed so it wouldn't get caught and yanked out of his hands. Suarez recovered to finish 16th. Cindric went on to close out the race 3rd, climbing to 15th in the overall standings and directly tightening the bubble that Van Gisbergen is now fighting to stay above. So where does all of this leave Shane Van Gisbergen heading into the final 2 races of the regular season? The same team that finally found the right strategic edge at Richmond, an edge that's eluded them for most of the year, only fully cashed in for one of their 2 cars. With New Hampshire and Daytona left before the chase field locks in for good, Preece's 50-point deficit is a tall order to close, but it's far from impossible. A bad Van Gisbergen finish paired with a strong run from Preece could shrink that gap in a hurry, especially at Daytona, where a single wreck can rewrite the entire bubble in an instant. But for right now, Van Gisbergen heads into the stretch run having done something most drivers clinging to the bubble simply can't say. He lost ground in the raw standings and somehow gained ground in the fight that actually decides his season. A first career oval pole in just his 5th truck start, a 4th-place finish carrying real momentum, a top 15 run pulled out of a genuine strategy gamble, and 3 extra points of breathing room over the driver chasing him hardest. That's the kind of weekend most drivers starting 31st would sign up for in a heartbeat, and it sets up New Hampshire and Daytona as two of the most important races of Van Gisbergen's Young Cup Series career. If you enjoyed this breakdown of one of the wildest weekends in the 2026 NASCAR season, make sure to hit that like button, and subscribe for more weekly NASCAR news, playoff breakdowns, and driver deep dives as this chase bubble battle heads into its final stretch.